very crudely, I'm going to kind of stereotype the problem as being two types of issue. One is that in some parts of the country, house prices are just way out of line. No one can afford them unless they're already very wealthy, or more likely because they've already managed to buy a house back when they were cheaper. That means that affordability is a real crisis. More and more people are forced to rent housing for far longer than they would want to. They're not able to buy a home of their own. It means there's huge pressure on space, so that more and more people are forced to overcrowd. It means that what social housing there is under huge pressure to be sold, worth so much, but also that there's a massive waiting list of people desperate to get in it. We all know, what an affordability crisis looks like. At the other end of the spectrum, and again, accepting this is a bit too crude, there are parts of the country where actually housing is still relatively cheap, but often it's the fact that there isn't enough economic wealth in the area to keep investment in housing up. The housing stock often declines. You end up with a often quite exploitative private rented sector, as speculative landlords have taken the advantage of low house prices to buy up large portfolios for letting out to people who really have no other choice but to let often very poor quality homes on housing benefit rates. So these are two very, very different ends of the problem. In fact, they're almost opposite of each other, because when you come to looking at the main system for addressing these problems, which is essentially government subsidy, the model really doesn't work in either case, because in those high value areas, it means that it's very difficult to make the argument to Treasury that what you need is much more subsidy, because they can see that the more subsidy they pour into expensive places, firstly, why the hell is the Treasury where's the Treasury using taxpayers' money to fund kind of rich people's homes, when these homes aren't going to be that affordable at the end of the day anyway? And in fact, there's clearly tons of value there. And what's worse is we can see that when we pour money down the pipes of the subsidy system in expensive places, half the time it just ends up inflating land values, enriching landowners and developers, and not even leading to the kind of public benefits that the subsidy is supposed to be there for. So this quite reasonably makes it very difficult to make the case for public investment. And it's very difficult to persuade people that the housing should be built in these locations, because it's not going to be affordable for them. The existing model based around the system tends to produce fairly unpleasant places, often quite poor quality homes that are extremely expensive in very unsustainable neighbourhoods that don't really offer very much in the way of infrastructure or wider community benefits for people who already live there. So it's hard to make the case to local people to accept housing, and it's hard to make the case to government to pay for it. But then in the other end of the spectrum, equally, the model doesn't work very well, because it's hard to argue with the Treasury that they should really be spending vast amounts of taxpayers' money to build homes in places where homes are already very cheap and plentiful. Quite a lot of them are empty. And in fact, often the cost of building new homes is higher than the value of the homes at the end of the day. So there's absolutely no economic case in the Treasury's eyes for public subsidy at all in those places. And equally, in those places, often it's very difficult to make the case for just handing sites and planning permission over to developers to build, again, often rather poor quality homes, because it's very difficult for developers to make low value places stack up economically. So our dominant model is kind of failing at both ends of the spectrum. And my suggestion as a kind of opening thought here is that the answer to both of these problems is in fact better involvement of the local community. That's not because it's one answer for all places. It's not one size fits all, but it's precisely because to avoid that problem, you need to have local people absolutely engaged in the planning, the delivery, the shaping, the long-term management, the ownership of homes and places, because that's the way that we can make solutions that really are appropriate for local places, that work for local people, and that are ultimately much more sustainable.